She thought she could get a black man removed from first class until he flashed his FBI badge. Vanessa Caldwell strode through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with the same polished ease she carried through every aspect of her life. Her designer carry-on glided behind her, its wheels silently skimming across the gleaming floor. She had made this journey many times, Atlanta to New York City, first class only. It was the standard, the only way she traveled. Everything about air travel was predictably seamless for Vanessa. Priority boarding, complimentary champagne, quiet conversations between professionals cloaked in muted tones. She relished the familiarity, the exclusivity of it all. Flying first class wasn't just a perk for her. It was an unspoken affirmation of her status, the kind of status she had spent decades cultivating. So, when Vanessa approached her row that afternoon and noticed a black man already seated next to her in seat 3, her perfectly timed steps faltered ever so slightly. He was dressed sharply, impeccable navy suit, polished shoes, and an air of quiet confidence that seemed intentional rather than circumstantial. His laptop was open, and his dark eyes scanned the screen as if studying something critically important. He exuded the kind of calm that belonged to someone who was not only competent, but deeply aware of the fact. Vanessa's lips thinned. She adjusted the silk scarf draped over her shoulders and lowered herself in a 3B with far less grace than usual. Her designer tote landed with a distinct thump at her feet. It was subtle, but it was enough. A message, one that declared, "I'm not pleased." Because first class, in her mind, wasn't supposed to be like this. The man beside her, his name, she would soon learn, was Marcus Harlan, barely acknowledged her arrival. His attention was absorbed entirely by the work in front of him. His fingers moved efficiently across the keyboard, the glow from his screen casting sharp shadows on his strong features. His composure radiated belonging. Vanessa, however, wasn't convinced. She inhaled slowly through her nose, her posture straightening with practiced elegance. Her purse nudged against the armrest they shared. No reaction from him. She turned her head, as if expecting a flight attendant to notice, to fix this mistake without her having to spell it out. But when that didn't happen, she took it a step further. Leaning slightly toward him, just enough to enter his space, Vanessa spoke in the kind of voice that was polite on the surface but sharp underneath. "Excuse me," she said, her tone measured. "Are you sure you're in the correct seat?" Marcus didn't glance up. "Yes," he replied simply. That was all. No elaboration. No polite explanation. Just certainty. Vanessa cleared her throat. Her gaze flickered toward the aisle, where a flight attendant was assisting another passenger. She gave a small, subtle wave. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Samantha Reeves, noticed and nodded. Samantha made her way over, her pleasant, professional smile firmly in place. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Samantha asked. Vanessa smiled thinly, pretending to laugh as if this was all an amusing misunderstanding. "I think there's been a mix-up," she said lightly. "I believe this gentleman may be in the wrong seat." Samantha's smile didn't falter as she pulled out her tablet and checked the passenger manifest. Marcus paused his typing for the first time and looked up. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't confusion. It was something else. Samantha tapped through the flight list efficiently. "Actually, Mr. Harlan is in the correct seat," she said smoothly. "Your ticket is 3B, and his is 3A. Vanessa blinked. Her fingers tightened around the leather armrest. "That's odd," she murmured, forcing another smile. Well, I just assumed." Samantha's own smile grew subtly firmer. "Everything looks correct, ma'am." For the briefest second, Vanessa's mask slipped. Her lips twitched before she gathered herself and turned toward the window, feigning indifference. But inside, she was simmering. She wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Marcus had already returned to his laptop, the soft clicking of his keys the only response she received. Samantha hesitated for a moment, sensing the unspoken tension, then gave Marcus a nod before stepping away. Vanessa sat stiffly. Her mind was racing. She had flown first class for years, decades, and this, this was new. This was unacceptable. Her hand hovered over the call button, her chest tight. Then she pressed it. Samantha returned, her composure as polished as before. Yes, ma'am. Vanessa kept her voice low, her tone carefully calibrated. I'd like to request a seat change. Samantha blinked once. Is there something wrong with your seat? Vanessa hesitated, then leaned in slightly. I don't feel comfortable sitting here, she said, her words slow, deliberate. Samantha's expression cooled by a few degrees. I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. If there's a problem with the seat itself. No, Vanessa interrupted, exhaling sharply. It's not the seat. She glanced sideways, not quite looking at Marcus, but enough to imply. I just prefer to sit elsewhere. Samantha glanced at Marcus, who hadn't moved. He had paused his typing, but hadn't said a word. He was listening, waiting, his hands resting lightly on the keyboard. Let me see if we have anything available, Samantha said. Vanessa sat back, her mouth pressed into a hard line. She watched Samantha tap through her tablet. I'm afraid we're at full capacity in first class today, Samantha said after a moment. There aren't any available seats. Vanessa's stomach twisted. Samantha's polite expression didn't budge. Would you like me to check for a seat in economy? She offered. Economy, Vanessa repeated, as if the word tasted bitter. No, that's not going to work. In that case, Samantha replied, you'll need to remain in your assigned seat. Vanessa inhaled through her nose, forcing another thin smile. I suppose I have no choice. But the rage simmering under her skin was far from over. She pressed the call button again. Samantha returned with a calm professionalism, but there was an unmistakable firmness in her tone now. Yes, ma'am. I need to speak with the head crew member. Or the pilot, Vanessa said, her voice tight. There was a pause. A ripple of murmurs drifted through first class. People were watching now. I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight, Samantha replied evenly. And the pilot is preparing for takeoff. Vanessa leaned closer. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. I don't feel safe. And just like that, everything changed. Samantha stiffened. Marcus stopped typing. Conversations around them quieted. Can you clarify what you mean, ma'am? Samantha asked carefully. Vanessa folded her hands neatly in her lap. I just don't feel comfortable, she said again. I think it would be best if someone else took this seat. Marcus closed his laptop quietly and turned to face her. His gaze locked on hers, unwavering calm. And for the first time, Vanessa felt a sliver of doubt snake through her confidence. But she wasn't finished. I don't feel safe, she repeated, louder this time. The words hung in the air like smoke from a flare gun. The businessman across the aisle muttered, Here we go. Samantha straightened. Are you saying you feel threatened, ma'am? Vanessa shrugged, the gesture subtle but loaded. I'm not saying that. I just don't feel comfortable. Passengers were whispering now. Some had pulled out their phones. I'll check again, Samantha said. But I remind you, mister, Harlan has a first-class ticket. There's room in coach, isn't there? Vanessa pressed. There are 2 seats in economy, Samantha acknowledged. Perfect, Vanessa said crisply. He can take one. A hush fell. Even the faint hum of the cabin felt quieter. Samantha exhaled through her nose. Ma'am, just to clarify, you're asking me to move Mr. Harlan to economy because you don't want to sit next to him. Vanessa sat straighter. Yes, that's not going to happen, Samantha said flatly. Vanessa's head snapped up. Excuse me, Mr. Harlan is in his assigned seat. He's not moving. The businessman nearby chuckled under his breath. Several passengers shook their heads. One woman was clearly recording. Vanessa's throat tightened. This is ridiculous, she hissed. I'm asking for a simple accommodation. You're asking for discrimination, Samantha replied. And that won't happen on my watch. Silence. If you cannot comply, Samantha added, you'll need to deplane. Vanessa froze. What? You can stay seated quietly? Or you can leave, Samantha said, calm but firm. But Mr. Harlan stays. Vanessa's cheeks burned. She opened her mouth, But before she could say another word, Marcus reached into his jacket. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a leather badge case and flipped it open. An FBI badge gleamed in the cabin lights. Gasps. Murmurs. The woman recording zoomed in. Marcus's voice was smooth level. "Would you like to file an official complaint, ma'am? I could take your statement now." Vanessa's breath caught. She stared at the badge, then at him. The air shifted. Passengers were no longer whispering about Marcus. They were staring at her. And Vanessa Caldwell realized, in that instant, she was trapped. And the consequences were only beginning.